Also this week we heard from Grover Norquist, the author of The Tax Pledge. He has had an enormous influence on Republicans in the Congress.
What do you hope to see come out of this convention?
I hope that both Paul Ryan, and Governor Romney will kind of introduce themselves as men, as individuals, as family guys, because a lot of people may be familiar with their general politics, but they also hear just the 30-second ads. So for non-aligned voters, swing voters, guys who are still making up their mind, understanding who Romney is as a person and getting to like him. And the same thing with Ryan. I think that's important. The second piece is to make sure people understand the Ryan plan, the welfare reform, the Medicare reforms, the tax reform plans, so that people have a general sense that they're comfortable with those, that they're not scary, that they will work. And if they can do those two things, both of which are doable in a few speeches, that's a good convention.
With respect to Governor Romney, do you believe somehow that the man he is not being perceived by America, notwithstanding the fact that he's been campaigning across this country for a fair number of months?
If you've sat through a half-hour speech of his, you've probably got it. Most Americans haven't. They get sound bites from television, and they haven't had the 15-minute conversation.
But he's been all over now doing 15-minute conversations, especially since he became a nominee.
I'm talking about the non-aligned voter, the independent voter, the person who doesn't follow politics. I, for instance, don't follow professional sports consistently. Yeah. And if you were to ask me a question, I would give you very odd answers. And swing voters tend to follow politics in the same way. They vaguely know what's going on. They know they have to make a decision in November, but that's not now. And so when the convention is the time for someone to say, I know I need to focus on this. I don't do this all day. It's not what my life is about. I will now focus. There's a convention. I'll watch the speeches. So I think there's a different audience for a convention than for debates where the base is listening.
What's the difference in Romney's view of the economy, of budgeting, of taxes, and the view that Congressman Ryan has put out there as his own, as a budget plan for House Republicans?
Sure. They're largely moving in the same direction. You want to reform government to make it less expensive, less intrusive. You want to reform taxes so that rates are lower, the base is broader, it's simpler, there are fewer pages in the code, and it has less of a drag on the economy. For both Ryan and Romney, they're pro-growth, Reaganite, Jack Kemp, pro-growth politicians that focus on growing the economy as the #1 agenda item.
But interestingly, when you talk about growth, people who are primarily interested in growth worry about cutting spending too much. It's the austerity versus growth debate.
Absolutely. That's why you need to do tax reform at the same time. It's what Reagan did with tax reform early on, reducing marginal tax rates, and then '86 tax reform. But the necessary part of that is to keep spending from spiraling out of control, and particularly from allowing entitlements, as the American electorate ages, from eating up more and more of the general economy.
As you know, the perception is that you do not want to compromise. And you do not want the people who signed the pledge to compromise. And what's necessary is compromise. Alan Simpson has articulated this, that he doesn't think anybody who doesn't want to compromise must have rocks in their brain.
Okay. Well, it depends what you mean by compromise. I'm in favor of compromising towards liberty. I'm in favor of all steps towards liberty, fast or slow. We got a $2.5 trillion spending cut agreed out of last year's budget. We wanted the Ryan plan, which is a $6 trillion reduction in spending over a decade. We only got half of what we wanted, but spending is coming down as a result of that agreement. No taxes were raised. It was a compromise towards liberty. We didn't get everything we wanted.
Was the compromise that the Speaker of the House was prepared to make in negotiations with the President a compromise you could have lived with because he was prepared to deal with the revenue side?
Well, I'm in favor of more revenue. If the economy grows faster, if the economy grows at 3% a year instead of 2%, that's $2.5 trillion in more revenue for the government because of economic growth.
But if the economy grows, everybody knows you have more revenue.
Yes, but some people tend not to count that as revenue. The Obama administration didn't want to count those dollars as revenue for purposes of an agreement.
But back to the point, I mean, you're saying that if John Boehner said that he was prepared to act on the revenue side, even though it was hard for him, you would have supported him in that compromise.
Okay. I've talked to Boehner about this. The revenue that he put on the table was always from growth, never from tax increases. I know the White House...
How about reduction of deductions?
If it's I'm in favor of reducing deductions and taking rates down, just as Reagan did in '86. If you take deductions and credits and get rid of them, and take that money and spend it, you've done two things. You've undermined spending restraint, because you've gone and spent more money, and you've undermined tax reform, because you have gotten rid of the deductions and credits we intend to spend to reduce rates. So raising taxes through eliminating deductions and credits undermines fundamental tax reform, makes it impossible to do, and undermines our effort to rein in spending. So that's a big no-no, because it does twice as much damage. One, it undermines spending restraint. Two, makes it difficult to have tax reform.
You could never bring yourself to support Simpson-Bowles.
Simpson-Bowles, the only numbers in Simpson-Bowles that are clear, apart from the page numbers, are that it wants to take 18.5% of GDP, present rate of full employment tax, up to 21. That over the next 10 years is a $5 trillion tax increase. $5 trillion tax increase. The spending restraint in Simpson-Bowles is written in haiku. It's not terribly clear.
But it was clear enough for some Republicans to support. And the objection of Congressman Ryan to supporting was limited.
Congressman Ryan...
I mean, he supported a lot of it.
Oh, I support all of the conversation about the spending cuts in Simpson-Bowles. Those are all a good idea.
You supported?
As long as the rates are reduced so that it's revenue neutral. But they wanted to have tax reform that would be a Trojan horse for $5 trillion in higher taxes. That was a big no-no. That was not going anywhere. And the reason why they've never written Simpson-Bowles down in legislative language is it would become clear to Republicans and the American people how big a tax increase it is, and even the tiny spending restraint they're talking about, no Democrat would vote for.
Are you clear in terms of the kinds of elimination of deductions that Congressman is in favor of? Has he laid it out clearly for you?
No, what he's laid out...
Elimination of deductions to increase the revenue.
No, what Ryan wants to do in the Ryan plan is to have a revenue-neutral tax reform. So there's not a tax increase, it's revenue-neutral. Rates come down to 25, corporate and individual, and you broaden the base to have it be revenue-neutral. It's not a net tax increase, it's revenue-neutral, just like Reagan did in '86. That's a good tax reform.
People are looking at all kinds of formulas in terms of deficit as a percentage of this and growth as a percentage of this. And one thing is the question of revenues as a percentage of GDP. Is there a number you like?
Lower is a good number.
Well, I know that, but that's not a number. That's a trend.
No, because the total cost of government, the deadweight cost of government, is total government spending. What you take and what you borrow add up to what you're spending. I'm much more interested in bringing spending down. Taxes you want to keep low so you don't overspend.
Tell me how you see the possibility of going off the fiscal cliff.
Well, there are two challenges in January 1st of next year.
The Bush tax cut being one?
There are a series of tax reductions that end. Some of them are Bush, some of them predate Bush. The alternative minimum tax patch, the R&D tax credit, all of these things. They total in the first year to $500 billion. So if nothing happens, if Obama was reelected or the Democrats have the Senate, they could just sit on their hands and without passing any legislation, $500 billion tax increase. That would be very bad for the economy. And the good news is that we came to just that crisis 2 years ago after the 2010 election, and Obama and the Democrats in the House and Senate agreed to a 2-year extension of all the tax cuts, plus some that Obama added in, expensing, which
so now we come to a day of reckoning again.
Again. I believe that at this point the Republicans will have the House and the Senate secure and the presidency, in which case you then pass the Ryan-Romney approach, no tax increase necessary, real spending reform like the welfare reform that Clinton put
And
forward.
does the Ryan budget include the $719 billion cut in Medicare?
One of the
Now, does it include it now?
Now, no. One of the versions that they passed was built on top of Obama's budget projections and therefore would have included that number. But he's clear now that Romney and he are for repealing Obamacare, which includes that transfer of the $700 billion from Medicare to Obamacare.
Was it a little bit disingenuous to attack the president for a reduction in Medicare when at the same time the Romney budget had a reduction in Medicare?
Since they were using his baseline, at some point, how much do you take the whole thing apart? They're working off of Obama's baseline since he, Ryan, has voted more than a dozen times to repeal the whole thing, and as have all the Republicans. They're pretty clear that they reject that transfer.
Is Paul Ryan the ideal candidate for you?
He has it all. I mean, the one challenge for Republicans is there's an embarrassment of riches on the bench. You have Scott Walker, who has done backflips in the state of Wisconsin, turning that state around economically, reforming all sorts of parts of government, including getting rid of tenure and dealing with public sector unions. You have Bobby Jindal, who's an expert on all sorts of things, starting with health care, governor of Louisiana. Rick Scott in Florida, who's turned this state around and made some very real steps forward. You've got half a dozen governors, Chris Christie, that are doing very, very interesting things. John Kasich in Ohio. There were such a number of people that you could have chosen that it's very interesting. I'm not sure we've had that before.
What test for you?
Seriousness about reforming the structure of government to make it more accountable
Does
and
that
more
mean
transparent.
seriously about reducing government? Because, you know, you're famous for that quote in which you said you'd like to see the government reduced so that you could fit into a bathtub and then you could drown it.
Well, to make it very small. But the full quote, in addition, says, look, the real goal, as opposed to the cute comment, is to reduce the size by me. Yeah. That the real goal is to drop the cost to government in half as a percentage of the economy over a 25-year period. That doesn't require any cut.
What does it require to reduce the size of government?
As a percentage of the economy.
Right.
You want to grow the economy.
So the economy gets larger.
Bigger, so that the same size government is a smaller burden.
Okay. Of the overall.
Of the overall. But then you also want to reform government. Look what Bill Clinton signed on welfare reform. He block-granted aid to families with dependent children in '96 and dropped the cost of number of people on welfare about in half since then. A lot of people got off dependency. That was a reform which led to less spending. It didn't come and do some Procrustean bed thing, you know, cut everything 10%. I'm much more interested in reforming government programs to create more competition. I wouldn't want to cut the post office. I would want to open it up to competition.
Who did more for the government in terms of an attitude about government and also for the economy? The 8 years of Bill Clinton or the 8 years of George Bush, 43?
Clinton years were 2 years where Clinton had Democratic Congress and 6 years with a Republican Congress in opposition.
They came in 94.
Right, 94 to 2000. The 2 years were a period of not much in the way of growth in any sense. The 6 years were a period of growth. When you had a Republican Congress saying no to his spending. The challenge for Bush was that there were 3 Bush administrations. First 2 years, Democrats ran the Senate. Middle 4 years, you had Republican House, Senate, and presidency. Those were the 4 years of economic growth because of the 2003 supply-side tax cuts. Then 2007, Democrats take the House and Senate. Spending starts going. All of Bush's years, spending went up too much. But in the last 2 years, really too much.
One of the arguments that's interesting about Obama and the criticism of the president is the stimulus program, and it didn't create growth, didn't create jobs, they argued that it did.
Yeah.
The other central part is they say that they had to compromise on the stimulus because they couldn't get more through the legislature, through the Congress, and that the Congress demanded the treatment of tax that it demanded, that was a Republican argument that they had to adhere to in order to get the stimulus through Congress.
Well, in the first 2 years, remember they had a supermajority in the House and up to 60 votes in the Senate. he passed most of his legislation. Obamacare was all passed by Democrats, no Republican votes. The stimulus, I think, had 2 Republican votes.
You're talking about Obamacare, you're talking about health care reform. I'm not talking about the stimulus bill.
Right. The stimulus bill in the House side, there were no Republican votes for it. They didn't even talk to the Republicans about that. They picked up 2 Republican votes, Specter and somebody from Maine. But otherwise, it was an all-Democrat proposal.
Do you believe that if President Obama is reelected, there is possible grand bargain to be made if there is a Republican-controlled House and Senate?
It's a good question. I tend not to think so because he hasn't been interested. When he had the upper hand with an overwhelmingly Democratic House, Senate, and presidency, he could have gone to the Republicans and maybe made the case for a grand bargain. He didn't do that.
So therefore, you don't think he'll make the case? Because I thought that was what the negotiations were with John Boehner, a grand bargain. I thought that was what was happening in the Senate with the Gang of Six, looking for a grand bargain between Republicans and Democrats.
Look, they were, and as you know, the Gang of Six was there, and they met for 8 months, and they never wrote anything down. Because the Democrats were never willing to put anything on the table on spending, and they wanted at least $1.5 trillion on higher taxes.
And that comes to one of the arguments. It is the Democrats say, well, it was not that. It's because House Republicans were not willing to compromise. In the end, because of you and the pledge and how they saw themselves and their country, they were not willing to compromise.
Well, raising taxes for a Republican is not compromising. It's betraying principle. Right? If somebody said, would you like to,
So suppose that the president would say, look, cutting entitlements is not a compromise because it's a principle. I believe that you cannot take action that will be detrimental to the health care or the well-being of whatever group of Americans.
Okay. The challenge...
Would you say, we understand your principle, Mr. President? We're deadlocked.
Spending other people's money is not a matter of principle.
Well, but I mean, they would say spending other people's money in the interest of a certain kind of safety net and other aspects isn't very much a principle.
And what the Republicans are talking about doing with the Ryan plan and others is to take the lessons learned from the Clinton welfare reform and apply those by block granting and reducing strings to Medicaid and food stamps and housing programs and jobs programs to save a great deal of money while giving a lot more flexibility. That doesn't damage anybody, and as we know from welfare reform, it made people better off and saved money. So these are the sorts of reforms that Clinton has shown worked. Obama hated it then. He hates it now when Republicans are taking the Clinton proposal and saying, let's expand it to other parts of government.
Well, the
He's
Republicans,
slightly to the left.
Well,
Clinton.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You may know more about this than I do, likely do. But that the so-called premium aspect of health care reform that is recommended by the Paul Ryan budget came from some elements of the Clinton administration's consideration of health care reform.
Yeah, it came out of something where he, Ryan, and Alice Rivlin, who was Clinton's budget person, came up with a proposal.
But ideas they thought and talked about when Clinton was trying to create health care reform.
Yeah. Look, Clinton might have had some grand bargain, and the Monica Lewinsky thing just blew everything up, and he had to go hard left to protect himself.
Okay, but back to a grand bargain. Suppose it is not the president reelected, it is Mitt Romney elected, and you have a Republican and Democratic Congress, which would certainly please you.
Then we'll have a grand bargain.
Which will be?
The Ryan plan, largely. Yeah. Which will save...
Which the president calls social Darwinism.
That's kind of, from a guy who was going to be the bipartisan non-name caller, he does an awful lot of name calling, an awful lot of blame shifting, and he plays nasty politics for a guy who's going to bring us all together and not be red or blue. I mean, all he does is whine about Bush.
But I mean,
I don't remember Bush whining about Clinton.
But your idea of a grand bargain is simply the Ryan plan. That's a bit like saying, for somebody to come in and say, look, my idea of a bargain is, what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable.
Okay. Well,
right?
Two things. We want to reduce government spending in a rational, reasonable, thought-through way. That's the Ryan plan on entitlement reform. And we want to have stronger economic growth through lower taxes. That's what the Republicans want to do, and I believe where the American people
do you
want
believe
to go.
That this president is prepared for entitlement reform if he's reelected?
No, because he was president for 4 years and made no effort to do it then.
Well, but I mean, you watch.
I'm serious.
No, but I mean, at the same time, you watch presidents who didn't do things in the first 4 years that they were able to later commit to. For example, your own the president you worked hard for, Bush 43, promised, as you have said, Social Security reform, immigration reform. It didn't happen.
Neither ended up happening. The Social Security can only be done with 60 votes. The rest of everything else in the budget can be done with 51 votes. Social Security is the one thing that's set aside. I think there was a tremendous missed opportunity on immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, that should have followed immediately after September 11th as part of both sound immigration policy and security.
What are the circumstances that would cause you to say, I do appreciate what happens if we go off a fiscal cliff? It will send this economy to a deeper place than it's ever been. We have to make a bargain. And the bargain means that we have to put everything on the table, including revenue. But what circumstance to avoid would bring you to that position?
Well, since the threat to the American economy are these massive tax increases, what we need to do is end those by not allowing the tax reductions to lapse, not allowing the AMT to hit 31 million families, which is what it does in January. We need to take the status quo, kick it out a year so you can reform taxes without the $500 billion tax increase next year. What we need to do is not raise taxes, and we need to reduce spending. What the Democrats want to do is, let's do two bad things. Let's not reduce spending, let's keep spending, and raise taxes.
But that's not what they say. They say what we want to do is to look at this, and Republicans too. I mean, well, Senator Coburn and others are saying, look, we should have to look at both sides. We have to look at the spending side and the revenue side. And as you know, you and Senator Coburn are at odds over this.
Correct, because he misunderstands what the problem is.
He misunderstands the problem. The man who was on, served in the Senate and was on this Simpson-Bowles committee and has been a huge proponent of debt reduction.
He thinks the problem is the deficit.
Right.
The problem is total spending. And so he thinks raising taxes helps solve the problem. He didn't pay attention in '82.
Compromise is part of solving the problem. He thinks somehow doing something about it is part of the problem.
I'm willing to cut taxes more slowly. I'm willing to cut spending more slowly. I'm always willing to compromise in the direction of liberty.
But are you aware that seems unreasonable? In a sense, you're saying, I'm willing to do the things that I want to do a little bit slower, and that's how I want to compromise.
Okay.
I do not want to compromise in terms of what you believe is your own analysis of the party. I mean, listen to Peter Orszag talking about you says, if you take everything out, Ron is assuming, and look at his corporate proposals, concrete proposals, his budget is not fiscally conservative. Without the magical reductions in Medicaid, other spending and tax rates, his plan would expand the deficit in 2040, not reduce it. Okay. Peter Orszag, former head of
He just said all of the welfare reform proposals on Medicaid that are patterned after Clinton's, take those out of the consideration, then you have a problem. Well, yeah, that's true. But that's imagining. What the Obama people have done in some cases, they say, we assume the following things are what Ryan means or Romney means. Then we put them into their proposal, and then their proposal's bad. That's not honest or honorable or serious.
Let me talk a bit about you and other things other than the taxes and budgets. Tolerance. Eric Cantor has talked to me about some interesting ideas he has about tolerance. Tell me what it is that you believe this country has to do. It is known, and that your wife is Muslim.
There are two things. One is I think that one of the things that makes the United States successful and great is that we're not Europe. We're not some ethnic group. We're not all one religion. We're not all the guys on this side of the river different than the guys on the other side of the river. We're not a bunch of guys sitting on a piece of territory that define who we are. We're people of the book, the Constitution. That's who we are. We believe in liberty. We believe in limited government. We believe that everybody should be free. And that includes, and the Constitution's rather clear on this, that includes religious liberty. People of all faiths, and the early founders were very serious about speaking to the Jewish minority and to other religious minorities to say, look, you got nothing to worry about here. We're about religious liberty.
Go ahead.
And now, the country doesn't always live up to that. Every new group, when the Roman Catholics were in, Romanism and rebellion, you know, that kind of nonsense was out there. The Mormon Church was rather viciously persecuted. Look, we've been down the road many times. That's why I'm an optimist, okay? Every new religious group that comes into the country got hazed, mistreated at first, dealt with suspicion. People have been worried about immigrants since the Germans started sneaking into Pennsylvania in the 1700s. There have always been these concerns. So I know we'll get through it, but that doesn't make it pleasant.
Grover Norquist, thank you.
Thanks.
Good to have you on the program.